The Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs by Steve Brusatte. Picture this. It's just before dawn on a freezing November morning in Beijing's Central Railway Station. The place is absolutely heaving with thousands of commuters, a complete chaos of bodies and noise. And there you are, standing alone, barely able to speak the language, gripping your train ticket like your life depends on it. Your heart is racing as you frantically try to match the symbols on your ticket to the platform signs, watching the minutes tick away toward departure time. This was exactly where a young paleontologist named Steve Brusatte found himself back in 2014, and he wasn't there on holiday. He was on a mission, racing toward a mystery, a fossil that a farmer had unearthed hundreds of miles away, near the North Korean border. All he'd seen were a few grainy photos, but he and his colleague in China, a famous dinosaur hunter named Juncheng Liu, had this feeling. You know that gut instinct when something might be really special? This could be one of those holy grail fossils. A brand new species, perfectly preserved, like a ghost from a lost world. After a frantic chase through the station and a 4-hour train ride, Brusatte was led into this unassuming museum, and there, resting on a small, buckling table, was this heavy slab of rock. As he got closer, the room seemed to fall silent, and what he saw absolutely took his breath away. It was a skeleton, roughly the size of a mule, sporting steak-knife teeth and long, vicious claws, clearly a cousin of the infamous velociraptor. But here's where it gets wild. Its bones were light and hollow, and covering its entire body was this coat of feathers. Bushy feathers adorned its head and neck, long branching feathers fanned out on its tail, and most incredibly, these huge quill-pen feathers on its arms were arranged into absolutely magnificent wings. This dinosaur looked exactly like a bird. This discovery, which would later be named Zhenhuan Long, is just one tiny scene in a story so vast, so utterly epic, it completely rewrites everything you thought you knew about the most incredible creatures to ever walk our planet. Today, we're diving into that lost world through Steve Brusatte's masterpiece, The Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs. This isn't just a book, it's basically a time machine. It has captivated millions of readers, becoming a New York Times bestseller and an instant classic because it does something truly remarkable. It makes these ancient animals feel genuinely alive again. Brusatte is part of this exciting new generation of scientists, a group of young, adventurous paleontologists who are living through what they call a golden age of discovery. Get this, on average, a brand new species of dinosaur is being discovered once a week. So here's my promise to you today. By the end of our journey together, you're not going to see dinosaurs as these slow, scaly, evolutionary dead ends that were somehow destined to fail. You'll see them as they truly were. Dynamic, intelligent, and astonishingly successful rulers of this planet for over 150 million years. This is their story, a tale of cataclysm and survival, of breathtaking innovation, and ultimately of a legacy that's still with us today, soaring in the sky right above your head. This is the epic of the dinosaurs. Our story doesn't actually begin with dinosaurs at all. It begins with the end of the world. If you could somehow travel back in time 252 million years to a period geologists call the Permian, you genuinely wouldn't recognize our planet. All the continents were smashed together into one absolutely massive landmass, a supercontinent we call Pangaea. The world was scorching hot, unbelievably humid, and ruled by creatures that honestly seemed like they were conjured up in some kind of fever dream. There were these slimy salamanders bigger than your average dog, stocky hippo-like reptiles called Prehistoric, and pig-like creatures called dicynodonts rooting around in the muck. And sitting pretty at the top of the food chain were the gorgonopsians, these bear-sized monsters sporting saber-like teeth that would give you nightmares. These were the undisputed kings of the world. Long before the first dinosaur ever drew breath, they seemed absolutely invincible. But then, deep within the earth, something sinister began to stir. Underneath what we now know as Siberia, this massive plume of molten rock, essentially a supervolcano, began to rise. And it didn't just erupt in one spectacular explosion. Instead, for hundreds of thousands of years, these giant cracks in the ground, stretching for miles, continuously belched out lava. We're talking enough lava to bury an area the size of Western Europe. This catastrophic event, known as the Permian-Triassic extinction, or more ominously as the Great Dying, was the closest life on Earth has ever come to being completely wiped out. The volcanoes didn't just spew lava, they pumped truly unfathomable amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, triggering this runaway greenhouse effect that basically boiled the planet. Dust blocked out the sun, plants withered and died, acid rain fell from the sky, and food chains completely collapsed. Somewhere around a staggering 90% of all species on Earth simply disappeared. The gorgonopsians, the Dinosaurs, all those mighty rulers of the Permian world, gone forever. When the dust finally settled after this apocalypse, the world was essentially a ghost town, an empty frontier. And this apocalyptic wasteland was the world the dinosaurs were actually born into. Life, however, has this amazing resilience. In the aftermath of the Great Dying, a brand new geological period began, the Triassic. And in this eerily empty world, the few survivors suddenly had an entire planet to themselves. It was this extraordinary time of grand biological experimentation. And among these new experiments was this group of reptiles called the Archosaurs, which translates to the ruling reptiles. Now, most reptiles of that time, and even today really, sprawl. Think of a lizard or a crocodile with their limbs jutting out to the sides. It's a stable way to get around, sure, but it's not exactly efficient for moving quickly. But some of these archosaurs evolved this absolutely revolutionary new posture. They tucked their limbs directly underneath their bodies. They started walking upright. This was an absolute game changer. Walking upright allows you to run faster, travel much farther, and use energy way more efficiently. It was this landmark evolutionary event, and it gave these particular archosaurs a huge advantage in the chaotic, still recovering world of the early Triassic. Very early on, these upright archosaurs split into two major family lines. Think of it as this great fork in the evolutionary road. One branch became the pseudosuchians, the crocodile line archosaurs. We'll definitely meet them again soon. The other branch became the avemetatarsaelians, the bird line archosaurs. And this is the line that would eventually lead to pterodactyls, to modern birds, and of course to dinosaurs. Deep in the Holy Cross Mountains of Poland, this young paleontologist and self-described field animal named Grzegorz Niedzwiecki, who happens to be a close friend of Steve Brusatte's, has spent his entire life hunting for fossils. But here's the thing, he doesn't just look for bones. He searches for traces, the footprints, handprints, and tail drags that ancient creatures left behind. He would often remind Brusatte that while an animal only has one skeleton, it can potentially leave millions of footprints throughout its lifetime. And in these ancient mudstones of Poland, dated to just a couple million years after the Great Dying, Grzegorz discovered this new type of track, The tracks were relatively small, about the size of a cat's paw, and they were narrow, clearly indicating that the creature that made them walked upright. The footprints had 3 long central toes, and the handprints were quite small. They named the mysterious trackmaker Pro-Rotodactylus. After studying these tracks extensively with Brusatte and another paleontologist named Richard Butler, they realized what they were actually looking at. This wasn't technically a true dinosaur yet, but boy was it close. It was what scientists call a dinosauromorph, essentially a proto-dinosaur. It was roughly the size of a house cat, gangly and pretty awkward-looking, walking around on all fours. It was fast, but it was also small, and crucially, it was rare. Less than 5% of all the tracks found at the site belonged to these proto-dinosaurs. They were the ultimate underdogs. They were this tiny, almost insignificant part of a world that was still very much dominated by other reptiles and these giant amphibians. For the next several tens of millions of years, these dinosauromorphs continued to evolve. The fossil tracks in Poland, beautifully stacked layer upon layer, tell this fascinating story. The tracks gradually get larger. Some of them start to show only footprints, no handprints at all. These creatures were now walking exclusively on 2 legs, which freed up their hands to grab prey. They were steadily getting bigger, faster, and way more dynamic. At some point during this journey, one of these dinosauromorphs crossed this invisible evolutionary line and became the first true dinosaur. The transition wasn't some massive evolutionary leap, though. It involved just a few subtle changes to the skeleton, maybe a new muscle attachment on the arm here, a slight change in the hip socket there. The truth is, the boundary between a proto-dinosaur and a true dinosaur is honestly a bit fuzzy, basically a line drawn by scientists more for the sake of classification. The real revolution had already happened. The evolution of these incredibly fast-running, upright dinosauromorphs from their much more sprawling ancestors. The first true dinosaurs show up in the fossil record around 230 million years ago, not in Poland actually, but far away in these mountainous canyons of Argentina, in this otherworldly place called Isquigualasto, which locals call the Valley of the Moon. This place is an absolute paradise for dinosaur hunters. The rocks here preserve this perfect snapshot of life in the Middle Triassic, and it was right here that paleontologists like the legendary Alfred Sherwood Romer and these brilliant Argentinian scientists José Bonaparte and Osvaldo Reg, and later on Paul Sereno, discovered the skeletons of the world's oldest known dinosaurs. There was Herrerasaurus, this mule-sized predator that could sprint impressively on its hind legs, like a primitive version of T-Rex. There was Eoraptor, a smaller, golden retriever-sized speed demon. And there were others, too, early ancestors of those great long-necked sauropods and the plant-chomping ornithischians. So the 3 major groups of dinosaurs, the meat-eating theropods, the long-necked sauropods, and the plant-eating ornithischians, had already diverged from each other by this point. The dynasty had officially begun. But here's the really interesting twist. They still weren't the kings. In Isquigualasto, dinosaur fossils actually make up only about 10 to 20% of the total ecosystem. They were vastly outnumbered by all these other creatures. There were these giant amphibians like Metaposaurus, basically car-sized salamanders lurking ominously in the water. There were those pig-like Dicynodonts and beaked rhynchosaurs happily munching on plants. And most importantly, there were these other ruling reptiles, The crocodile line archosaurs, the pseudosuchians, these were the true rulers of the Triassic period. There were these armored, tank-like plant eaters, called dinosaurs. There were fast-running, almost greyhound-like crocodiles. And sitting at the very top of the food chain were the Rauisuchians, absolutely ferocious, 25-foot-long predators like Saurosuchus, this four-legged monster that would have absolutely haunted the nightmares of the first dinosaurs. Throughout the entire Triassic period, for a solid 30 million years after they first appeared, dinosaurs were basically overshadowed. They were playing second fiddle to their crocodile cousins. Many of these crocodile-line archosaurs looked and behaved so incredibly similar to dinosaurs, this phenomenon scientists call convergence, that for the longest time, paleontologists actually mistook their fossils for dinosaurs. It was genuinely far from certain that dinosaurs were somehow destined for greatness. They were even held back by the climate itself. During the Triassic, the supercontinent of Pangaea had these absolutely extreme weather patterns. This vast, scorching desert stretched right across the equator. The early dinosaurs, it seems, simply couldn't handle that intense heat. Their fossils are consistently found in the more temperate, humid belts to the north and south, but they were completely absent from those arid tropics. For millions upon millions of years, they were geographically contained, totally unable to break free. They were underdogs, literally trapped by climate conditions, and kept firmly in their place by these more dominant competitors. If you were a betting person way back in the Triassic, you honestly would have put all your money on the crocodile-line archosaurs to eventually conquer the world. But then, as it often does, the world changed again. Pangaea, that great supercontinent, had been straining at the seams for millions of years. These deep geological forces were steadily pulling it apart. Around 201 million years ago, right at the very end of the Triassic, the breaking point was finally reached. The supercontinent began to literally unzip right down the middle. And when a continent tears apart like that, it essentially bleeds lava. Absolutely massive volcanic eruptions, on a scale eerily similar to the ones that had ended the Permian, began to rip across the planet. For over 500,000 years, successive waves of lava drowned central Pangaea, and truly enormous amounts of greenhouse gases were released into the atmosphere. The world was plunged headlong into yet another mass extinction. This time around, however, the dinosaurs turned out to be the lucky ones. For reasons we still don't completely understand, they managed to survive. But their main rivals, those diverse and incredibly successful crocodile-line archosaurs, were almost completely wiped out. The giant amphibians were absolutely decimated. The pig-like decenodonts and beaked rhynchosaurs were utterly gone. The end-Triassic extinction basically cleared the board. It finally gave the dinosaurs this opening they had been patiently waiting 30 million years for. They emerged from the ashes to find themselves in a brand new, much emptier world. And this time, they absolutely conquered it. The dawn of the Jurassic period marks the true beginning of the age of dinosaurs. With their main competitors finally gone, they literally exploded in diversity. They grew substantially larger and spread across the entire globe, finally colonizing those deserts and humid regions they couldn't access before. This newfound dominance is perfectly captured by one particular group, the sauropods. These are hands down the most unmistakable dinosaurs of all, those long-necked, pot-bellied, plant-devouring absolute behemoths like Brontosaurus, Brachiosaurus, and Diplodocus. They were the largest animals to ever walk on land, with some weighing more than a Boeing 737 aircraft. Their sheer size is so completely mind-boggling that it genuinely pushes the limits of what we thought was biologically possible. So how on earth did they get so ridiculously big? It wasn't just one single thing, but rather this perfect storm of unique adaptations working together. First off, those incredibly long necks. Evolving from much smaller Triassic ancestors, their necks got proportionally longer and longer over time. This ingenious design allowed them to reach high up into the trees, accessing a food source that literally no other plant eaters could touch. It also meant they could just stand in one spot and graze this absolutely huge area, kind of like a biological cherry picker, taking in massive amounts of food while using remarkably little energy. Second, they grew at an incredibly fast rate. By carefully studying the growth rings in their bones, yes, just like tree rings, scientists have discovered that a sauropod could go from being a guinea pig-sized hatchling to becoming a multi-ton adult in just 30 or 40 years. During their teenage growth spurt, they might have been putting on several hundred pounds every single year. Third, and this might be the most ingenious part of all, they had this respiratory system unlike anything we mammals have. They breathed exactly like a bird does. Mammals like us have this pretty simple two-way lung system. We breathe in, we breathe out. Birds have this much more sophisticated, one-way, flow-through lung system with an intricate network of air sacs. This system is incredibly efficient, allowing them to extract oxygen during both inhalation and exhalation. We know for certain that sauropods had this same system because their vertebrae are absolutely full of these hollow spaces and openings where these air sacs would have been located. This super-efficient lung system provided the truly enormous amount of oxygen needed to power their massive bodies and incredibly high metabolisms. And here's the brilliant part. These air sacs had this fantastic double benefit. They also made the entire skeleton incredibly lightweight. The long neck vertebrae of a sauropod were mostly hollow inside, structured like a honeycomb, amazingly strong, but not prohibitively heavy. Without this clever adaptation, their necks would have been far too heavy to even lift off the ground. This unique combination of features, a long neck enabling efficient feeding, incredibly rapid growth rates, and this hyper-efficient, skeleton-lightening respiratory system, was basically the secret recipe for gigantism. It was this perfect evolutionary toolkit for becoming absolutely enormous, and it's precisely why no other land animal, before or since, has ever come anywhere close to their truly massive size. The late Jurassic, roughly 150 million years ago, was absolutely the golden age of these magnificent giants. In this place called the Morrison Formation in the western United States, this incredibly fossil-rich rock deposit that became the infamous battlefield for the so-called Bone Wars between rival paleontologists Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh, we find this truly spectacular ecosystem preserved in stone. Here, multiple species of absolutely gigantic sauropods somehow lived side by side, the giraffe-like Brachiosaurus reaching for the very highest leaves, the vacuum cleaner-like Diplodocus grazing contentedly on low shrubs, and the stocky Camarasaurus eating these tougher plants, with its specialized chisel-shaped teeth. They weren't all competing directly for the exact same food source. They were cleverly partitioning the resources, with each species specializing in a different part of this massive plant buffet. And of course, where you have these giant herbivores, you inevitably have giant predators hunting them. Stalking these sauropods was the so-called butcher of the Jurassic, Allosaurus. A truly impressive 30-foot-long, 2-ton carnivore, Allosaurus likely hunted by using its massive head almost like a hatchet, opening its powerful jaws incredibly wide and violently slashing down on its prey, with its sharp, thin teeth efficiently slicing through flesh. Living right alongside them were the truly iconic plated Stegosaurus, using its heavily spiked tail as a formidable defense weapon, and this whole fascinating host of smaller plant-eaters and meat-eaters. During the late Jurassic period, Pangaea was still largely connected, so this same incredible cast of characters could be found all over the world, from North America to Portugal to Tanzania. Dinosaurs were at their absolute peak of success, a truly global empire, seemingly unchallenged and apparently eternal. As the Jurassic gradually gave way to the Cretaceous period, the world just kept on changing. The continents steadily drifted further and further apart, and that single dinosaur empire began to fracture into these separate kingdoms. The dinosaurs living on different continents began evolving in complete isolation from each other, which led to an even greater explosion of diversity. The sauropods, while still enormous and impressive, became somewhat less dominant in the northern continents. Their place as the primary large herbivores was gradually taken over by brand new groups of ornithischian dinosaurs. There were the hadrosaurs, often called the duck-billed dinosaurs, like Edmontosaurus, which had these incredibly complex jaws, packed with literally hundreds of teeth, all grinding together into these efficient batteries, absolutely perfect for chewing the tough, newly evolved flowering plants. And then there were the ceratopsians, those impressive horned dinosaurs, like the famous Triceratops. These were basically the rhinoceroses of the Cretaceous world, moving around in these vast herds, with their formidable horns and those massive frills, used both for elaborate display and, when absolutely necessary, for defense against the terrifying apex predators of their time. And speaking of those predators, who exactly were they? The allosaurs had pretty much faded away by this point. In their place, this entirely new dynasty of carnivores had risen to absolute power. On the southern continents of South America and Africa, which remained connected for quite a bit longer, it was the Carcharodontosaurs, these so-called shark-toothed lizards, and these bizarre, stubby-armed creatures called ebelosaurs that ruled with an iron fist. But up in the north, across Asia and North America, a very different kind of tyrant was steadily emerging. Their story is honestly one of the most remarkable in the entire history of life on Earth. They didn't just burst onto the scene as kings right from the start. They began their long journey way back in the Middle Jurassic, around 170 million years ago. The first ones, creatures like Kilescus from Siberia and Guanlong from China, were actually quite small, roughly human-sized predators. They were impressively fast and agile, sure, but they definitely were not sitting at the top of the food chain. For over 80 million years, just think about that time span, they lived completely in the shadows of much larger predators, like Allosaurus, and those intimidating Carcharodontosaurs. They were marginal players at best, a dynasty patiently waiting in the wings. They were the Tyrannosaurs. For reasons that honestly still remain a bit of a scientific mystery, around 90 million years ago, those Carcharodontosaurs that had ruled the northern continents for so long suddenly disappeared. Perhaps it was due to long-term climate change and these constantly shifting sea levels. Whatever the actual cause was, their extinction left this enormous power vacuum. And the Tyrannosaurs, which had been so patiently biding their time for literally millions upon millions of years, finally stepped up to fill that void. And they didn't just casually step up, they took over with absolutely breathtaking speed. In the span of just a few million years, they went from being these mid-sized hunters to becoming absolutely colossal, bone-crushing apex predators. Which brings us to the king himself, Tyrannosaurus rex. Living right at the very end of the Cretaceous period, from about 68 to 66 million years ago, T-Rex was actually an immigrant species. Its ancestors originally came from Asia, crossing over a land bridge into North America, where they very quickly established this continent-wide dominion. A full-grown adult was over 40 feet long and weighed somewhere around 7 or 8 tons. It was hands down the largest pure land predator of all time. And absolutely everything about this creature was specifically built for killing. We used to think of T-Rex as this slow, lumbering scavenger that just ate what it found. That couldn't possibly be further from the actual truth. Through these incredibly advanced computer models and biomechanical studies, we now know it was actually a surprisingly agile and genuinely energetic animal, easily capable of moving at speeds somewhere between 10 to 25 miles per hour. Not exactly a sprinter like a cheetah, but definitely a powerful and terrifying ambush predator. Its true weapon, though, was that absolutely massive head. The skull was a full 5 feet long, but it was anything but delicate. The bones were incredibly thick and heavily fused together, specifically built to withstand truly enormous stress. And the power generated behind that skull was just immense. By creating these detailed digital models and running sophisticated engineering analyses, scientists have actually calculated that T-Rex had the strongest bite force of any land animal that has ever lived, period. While an Allosaurus would slice through flesh, T-Rex straight up crunched through bone. It could bite down with a force of several thousands of pounds per individual tooth, more than enough to completely shatter the skeletons of its unfortunate prey. We can actually see the proof in these fossilized Triceratops hips with these deep puncture marks, and even more incredibly in fossilized T-Rex dung, which is absolutely packed full of bone fragments. But T-Rex wasn't just all brawn and no brains. It actually had serious intelligence. By using advanced CT scanners to look deep inside their fossilized skulls, we can now reconstruct their actual brains and sense organs with remarkable accuracy. T-Rex had a relatively large brain for a dinosaur, roughly as smart as a modern chimpanzee, and significantly much smarter than a dog or a cat. Its olfactory bulbs, that's the part of the brain specifically responsible for processing smell, were absolutely enormous, giving it this superb sense of smell that would put a bloodhound to shame. Its delicate inner ear was specifically tuned to hear low-frequency sounds, which made it perfect for tracking the heavy footsteps of huge prey from quite a distance. And its eyes were positioned forward-facing on its skull, giving it excellent binocular vision and really impressive depth perception, just like we humans have. This wasn't some mindless, instinct-driven monster. It was actually a sophisticated, genuinely intelligent hunter with impressive sensory capabilities. We even have pretty strong evidence that they were actually social animals. Up in Canada and over in Mongolia, these mass graves of their close relatives, species like Albertosaurus and Tarbosaurus, have been discovered, containing individuals of all different ages buried together. It's quite likely that T-Rex hunted in coordinated packs, which is honestly a terrifying thought when you really think about it. Imagine a family of 7-ton bone-crunching predators working together strategically. But perhaps the most genuinely surprising thing about T-Rex? It was quite probably covered in feathers, at least partially. We haven't actually found a fully feathered T-Rex skeleton yet, but many of its earlier, smaller relatives in the Tyrannosaur family tree, creatures like Dilong and the impressively 30-foot-long Uteranus from China, were discovered covered in this coat of simple, hair-like proto-feathers. These weren't designed for flight, obviously, but more likely for elaborate display purposes or simply to help keep them warm. It's almost certainly the case that the king himself had at least some fluffy covering. especially when young. But the Tyrannosaurs, for all their incredible power and dominance, were definitely not the only fascinating evolutionary story unfolding during this time. One relatively small group of dinosaurs was quietly embarking on an even more incredible journey. This is the truly amazing story of how dinosaurs actually learned to fly. Way back in 1861, just 2 short years after Charles Darwin published his revolutionary On the Origin of Species, these quarry workers in Germany stumbled upon a fossil that would genuinely change everything. It was this 150-million-year-old creature with the basic skeleton of a reptile, complete with sharp teeth, a long bony tail, and claws on its hands. But it was absolutely covered in the magnificent feathers of a bird, beautifully arranged into proper wings. They called it Archaeopteryx. It was essentially this perfect, missing link, a creature seemingly caught halfway between reptile and bird. One of Darwin's staunchest defenders, a brilliant scientist named Thomas Henry Huxley, carefully looked at Archaeopteryx and saw this uncanny resemblance to small meat-eating dinosaurs. He boldly proposed this truly radical idea for the time, that birds actually descended directly from dinosaurs. For the next entire century, that controversial idea was absolutely fiercely debated in scientific circles. But then in the 1960s, this paleontologist named John Ostrom discovered a dinosaur up in Montana that was just astonishingly bird-like in its features. It was this incredibly lithe, dynamic predator with these long arms and this distinctive sickle-shaped claw on its foot. He called it Deinonychus. It was a raptor. Looking very carefully at Deinonychus, Ostrom essentially resurrected Huxley's old theory, which sparked what we now call the dinosaur renaissance. This genuine revolution that completely reimagined dinosaurs as active, intelligent, warm-blooded animals, very much like modern birds. The final, definitive proof came in the 1990s from Liaoning province in China. Here, in these ancient lake beds that had been buried by successive layers of volcanic ash, an entire ecosystem of perfectly preserved, genuinely feathered dinosaurs was discovered. Literally thousands upon thousands of fossils have been found there, ranging from small plant eaters sporting porcupine-like quills to giant tyrannosaurs covered in that fuzzy down, to raptors with absolutely full-on wings. These incredible fossils tell us this truly amazing story. Birds are not simply descended from dinosaurs in some distant way. Birds literally are dinosaurs. They're actually just a small, specialized branch of the meat-eating theropod family tree, the exact same group that includes both T-Rex and Velociraptor. And here's what's really mind-blowing. All those classic features we automatically associate with birds, feathers, wishbones, hollow bones, even their super-efficient lung system, did not originally evolve for the purpose of flight. They actually evolved in their ground-dwelling dinosaur ancestors for completely other reasons. Feathers first appeared as these simple, hair-like filaments, probably primarily to help keep small dinosaurs warm. The wishbone evolved in early theropods, specifically to strengthen their shoulders for more effectively grabbing prey. Hollow bones and those air sacs evolved to create this lightweight but incredibly strong skeleton and a highly efficient respiratory system, perfectly suited for an extremely active lifestyle. Wings themselves most likely evolved first primarily for display purposes. Many of these feathered dinosaurs, like Brusatte's own discovery Zhenyuanlong, had these large, absolutely magnificent wings, but they were far too big and heavy to actually fly. Microscopic analysis of their beautifully fossilized feathers reveals that they were often brightly colored, with some even showing signs of being iridescent. These impressive wings were basically living billboards, used to attract potential mates and intimidate rivals. But once you have these large, extensively feathered surfaces attached to your arms, they naturally start to interact with the air around you. They begin to produce lift. And in one small particular lineage of these winged dinosaurs, a lineage that was also gradually getting smaller and smaller in overall body size, these display billboards were almost accidentally repurposed into actual airfoils capable of generating flight. Flight, it seems, happened almost entirely by accident, as a side effect of other adaptations. And it probably happened multiple different times in many different evolutionary ways. There was this whole experimental phase of evolution where various different dinosaurs independently took to the air. Some, like the four-winged Microraptor, were primarily gliders swooping between trees. Others, like the truly bizarre bat-winged Yiqi, had wings made of thin skin membranes, not feathers at all. But one of these lineages actually mastered true powered, flapping flight. Their bodies became even more highly specialized over time. They completely lost their long, bony tails. Their teeth were gradually replaced by lightweight beaks, and their chest muscles became absolutely enormous to generate the power needed for sustained wing strokes. These remarkable creatures were the first true birds, and they turned out to be a genuinely wild success story. For the last 100 million years of the entire age of dinosaurs, these early birds happily coexisted with their giant dinosaur relatives, diversifying into literally thousands of species that filled the skies, colonized the trees, and occupied the waterways all across the globe. Which brings us, unfortunately, to the end. 66 million years ago, the world was absolutely teeming with this incredible diversity of dinosaurs living everywhere. In North America, the mighty T-Rex hunted these vast herds of Triceratops and Edmontosaurus. Down in South America, giant Carcharodontosaurs preyed on even more gigantic Titanosaur sauropods. Over in Europe, these bizarre dwarf dinosaurs had evolved on isolated islands. And soaring overhead, this dazzling array of birds and other flying dinosaurs filled the skies in spectacular abundance. Dinosaurs were at the absolute top of their game. They had successfully ruled the entire world for over 150 million years. They honestly seemed completely invincible, like nothing could possibly bring them down. And then, in literally a single day, it all came crashing to an end. One otherwise ordinary morning, the dinosaurs would have gradually noticed this new star appearing in the sky, this mysterious orb that grew steadily brighter and larger with each passing day. It was actually an asteroid, roughly 6 miles wide, basically the size of Mount Everest, hurtling directly towards Earth at over 60,000 miles per hour. When it finally slammed into what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, the catastrophic impact released the energy equivalent of roughly 1 billion nuclear bombs detonating simultaneously. It instantly gouged out this massive crater over 100 miles wide and 25 miles deep into the Earth's crust. The story of how we actually know all this is genuinely a detective story in itself, painstakingly pieced together by this brilliant geologist named Walter Alvarez. Back in the 1970s, in this gorge in Italy, he discovered this thin but distinctive layer of clay that marked the precise boundary between the age of dinosaurs and the age that came immediately after. This mysterious clay layer was found to be absolutely packed with iridium, a metal that's incredibly rare on Earth's surface, but surprisingly common in asteroids. That telltale iridium layer has now been found all over the entire world. It is literally the fingerprint of the killer, preserved in stone. The immediate effects of the impact were nothing short of apocalyptic. The impact instantly triggered earthquakes of magnitude 10 or even higher, violently shaking the entire planet. It caused these absolutely massive tsunamis, thousands of feet high, that washed hundreds of miles inland, drowning everything in their path. It completely vaporized both the asteroid and the bedrock beneath, sending this enormous plume of superheated dust and molten rock shooting high up into the atmosphere. As this debris inevitably rained back down to Earth, it heated the air to literally the temperature of an oven, igniting these massive global wildfires that spread across entire continents. The dinosaurs living in North America, being closest to the actual impact site, would have experienced this hellscape firsthand, and immediately. They were burned alive, battered by earthquakes, and shaken violently to death within just a few hours of the impact. But honestly, the absolute worst was yet to come. The thick soot from all those global wildfires and the massive amounts of dust from the impact itself completely clogged the atmosphere, effectively blocking out the sun for years, maybe even an entire decade or more. This created what scientists call a nuclear winter. The entire planet grew cold and dark. Photosynthesis completely stopped, and plants everywhere died. The herbivores that depended on eating those plants slowly starved to death, and the carnivores that ate those herbivores inevitably soon followed. Food chains both on land and in the sea completely collapsed worldwide. It was honestly the perfect storm of total destruction. A quick, violent kill from the initial impact, followed by this long, agonizingly slow death from starvation in the perpetual dark. It's estimated that somewhere around 70% of all species on Earth went extinct during this event. So why did some manage to survive while so many others completely perished? The dinosaurs were, in a cruel twist of fate, victims of their own incredible success. Most of them were quite large, which meant they couldn't easily hide underground or burrow to safety. They had these high metabolisms, which meant they needed a constant, substantial supply of food to survive. And they were positioned at the top of these food chains that were entirely based on living plants which were now completely gone. The survivors, on the other hand, tended to be the small and the highly adaptable, the little mammals that could burrow deep underground to escape. The crocodiles and turtles that lived in rivers and lakes, existing in ecosystems based on detritus and decaying organic matter, which was now suddenly plentiful everywhere. And remarkably, some of the dinosaurs actually did survive too. A small handful of bird species somehow managed to make it through this apocalypse. We don't know exactly why these particular ones survived, but it was most likely a fortunate combination of several factors. They were small and agile. They could fly, which allowed them to escape the immediate devastation and actively search for safe havens. Many of them had specialized beaks adapted for eating seeds, these little packets of concentrated nutrition that could lie dormant buried in the soil for years, patiently waiting for the sun to finally return. And of course, they had a whole lot of plain good luck on their side. The fall of the dinosaurs was sudden, absolutely catastrophic, and really just a matter of terrible cosmic bad timing. Our latest research actually shows that while most dinosaur groups were genuinely thriving right up to the end, the big herbivores at the base of the food chain in North America were experiencing just a slight dip in diversity right before the impact hit. This seemingly minor detail may have actually made their ecosystems more fragile overall, more vulnerable to complete collapse when disaster struck. If that asteroid had hit just a few million years earlier, or alternatively a few million years later, The dinosaurs quite possibly might have stood a much better chance of surviving, but it didn't hit at a different time. It hit at pretty much the worst possible moment. The dynasty fell dramatically. That incredible 150 million year reign was suddenly over. The world now belonged entirely to the survivors. In the Badlands of New Mexico, Brusatte and his colleagues carefully dig through the rocks that were laid down in the first few 100,000 years immediately after the impact. Below that distinctive boundary layer, there are abundant bones of giant tyrannosaurs and massive sauropods. Above it, there are absolutely none to be found. But what they do find in those higher layers is this remarkable explosion of mammal fossils. Badger-sized burrowers, saber-toothed flesh-eaters, and even these cow-sized plant-eaters. The mammals, which had lived completely in the shadows of the dinosaurs for over 150 million years, always staying small and secretive to survive, now finally had their long-awaited chance. The world was theirs at last, and among them was this small, roughly puppy-sized creature called Torrejonia. It was actually one of the very first primates to ever exist, one of our own incredibly distant ancestors. That is the final, deeply profound lesson of this entire epic story. The catastrophic fall of the dinosaurs was actually what made our modern world possible. Their extinction cleared the way for the explosive rise of mammals, and eventually, many millions of years later, for us. When you finally finish a book like The Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs, you honestly don't just close the cover and casually move on with your day. The story genuinely stays with you. It fundamentally changes the way you see the world around you. You start to really understand that the history of life isn't this simple, straight line of steady progress leading inevitably to us. It's actually this sprawling, chaotic, and often brutally random epic, shaped just as much by pure chance and sudden catastrophe as it is by gradual adaptation and competition. The dinosaurs were absolutely not failures, by any reasonable measure. They were actually one of the greatest success stories in the entire history of life on this planet. They ruled this Earth for a length of time that is almost genuinely impossible for us humans to properly comprehend, more than 150 million years. Just to put that into proper perspective, our own species, Homo sapiens, has only been around for maybe 300,000 years at most. The dinosaurs' reign was literally 500 times longer than our entire existence as a species. They successfully endured shifting continents, dramatically fluctuating sea levels, and absolutely massive volcanic eruptions. They evolved into the largest animals to ever walk on land, and they even invented powered flight. Their story is honestly a masterclass in biological resilience and evolutionary adaptation. And yet, in literally a single day, through absolutely no fault of their own, their massive empire completely crumbled. It's such a humbling lesson when you really think about it. It teaches us this powerful truth that dominance is never truly permanent. No matter how successful, how powerful, or how seemingly well-adapted a species becomes, it is always vulnerable to the completely unexpected. The universe, it seems, has this way of periodically reminding us that nothing, absolutely nothing, lasts forever. For me personally, the most powerful takeaway from Steve Brusatte's work is this incredible sense of deep connection to an almost unimaginably ancient past. The world under our feet is not just dirt and ordinary rock. It's actually this vast library of ancient stories waiting to be read. And paleontologists like Brusatte are essentially the librarians, the dedicated decoders, who are learning to read these stories with ever greater clarity and detail. They're not just digging up old bones for museum displays. they're actually resurrecting entire lost worlds and bringing them back to life. So how can you take the profound lessons from this incredible story and apply them to your own everyday life? It's obviously not about preparing for an actual asteroid strike, but more about fundamentally shifting your perspective on life. First, the very next time you happen to see a bird, whether it's just a pigeon on the sidewalk, a sparrow in a tree, or a seagull by the shore, take a genuine moment to really look at it closely. Don't just casually see a bird. Try to see a living dinosaur. See a survivor of an apocalypse. See this tiny, feathered testament to an empire that rose to global dominance, ruled for an eternity, and then fell in a dramatic blaze of cosmic fire. It's honestly a powerful reminder that history is not just something stuck in the distant past. It's literally all around us, living and breathing right now. Second, really try to think about the almost incomprehensible scale of deep time. The story of the dinosaurs unfolds over hundreds of millions of years, a time span our brains aren't really built to grasp. When you start to truly grasp that immensity, the problems and anxieties of our own individual lives, even the serious crises of our own time, can start to feel just a little smaller, a little more manageable. It gives you this sense of perspective that is somehow both humbling and strangely liberating at the same time. And finally, let this amazing story genuinely ignite your natural curiosity about the world. The world is absolutely full of incredible stories just like this one, hidden in plain sight all around us, just waiting to be discovered. Whether it's in the rocks beneath your feet, the stars scattered across the night sky, or even the complex history of your own family, there are epic tales absolutely everywhere. The dinosaurs teach us this wonderful lesson that the world is far older, far stranger, and far more wonderful than we can possibly imagine. That was our journey through The Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs by Steve Brusatte. We've walked through the highlights of this incredible epic together, but I'll be completely honest with you. A summary, no matter how detailed I try to make it, can only ever really be a map. The real adventure, the actual magic, happens when you travel the terrain yourself and experience it firsthand. The true magic of this book is in the way Brusatte tells the story, the genuine passion he brings to the science, the way he makes these ancient creatures feel like living, breathing characters you actually care about. This summary is designed to give you a glimpse of that world, to help you decide if this is a journey you want to take yourself. If anything we've talked about today has genuinely sparked your imagination or curiosity, I really urge you to grab a copy and read it. Reading it isn't just about passively learning facts. It's honestly an experience that will genuinely change the way you see our planet and the long, incredible story of life itself. A link to the book is right there in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable and enjoyed our journey back through time together, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. It really lets us know we're on the right track with this content, and it ensures you won't miss our next exploration into another potentially life-changing book. Let's keep learning and growing together.